come today to another interval. This is interval 2. And our process of learning is an inquiry that adjusts itself constantly to the expansion or the deepening of our quality of attentiveness. And so this kind of a learning classically used to be called a yoga. This, though, is not a yoga like a hatha yoga for the body or a karma yoga for actions, not even a raja yoga with all of them together, not a bhakti yoga, but one might call it a yoga of civilization. And the reason that we are doing this is that our learning now needs to make a shift to a farther dimension from that of classical education. There have been many attempts in history to do this, and more or less successful in the past at various times. And we're going to take today an example for interval 2 of something done about 2,500 years ago by the historical Buddha, which was a introduction at that time of something of what this education is doing here in the beginning of the 21st century. And that is to take learning out of its mold and to put it into an algorithmic improvement dynamic so that new forms can come out of it. Because we live in a context now, not just our world, but our world is expanding for the first time beyond our planet. And in our time, we have seen already the exploration by machines of the entire star system. And it won't be long, probably before the generation following us reaches maturity, will have expanded at least to the moon, and very soon after that to Mars. And though it will be like pioneering, it is only pioneering in the sense that small populations will do it first. What has been pioneered already during the 1970s and 1980s is the extension of our civilization to the entire star system. I remember being in Pasadena at the convention center with all of the people from Caltech and JPL and a great number of interested people collected together, several thousands, following Voyager 2's encounter with Neptune. And what a joy it was to be able to reach 3 billion miles out into deep space and to be able to do a reconnaissance on Neptune. And that reconnaissance at the time was somewhat of a technological miracle, because when Voyager 1 and 2 were first launched, they did not have the capacity to extend themselves that far out in the solar system. In fact, the extension originally planned only went out to Saturn. And in order to go beyond Saturn to Uranus, they had to learn how to upgrade the equipment that was on Voyager 2 to be able to bring telemetry back from Uranus. And then another step, by going out to Neptune, which is even much farther out, they had to upgrade the equipment again. And so Voyager 2 taught us that we have to make forms that are improvable while they're in the process of being used. This is a very, very great step forward. It means also not only the tools, but we ourselves, the tool makers and the tool users, have to learn to refine ourselves while we're in the process of living. And so it's no longer just a catchphrase of saying a continuing education for life. It is that our species now is in a situation where there is an algorithmic improvement of all dynamical processes and of all energized forms that we are going to encounter from here on out, including ourselves. And so this is a new kind of an education, a new kind of a learning for our time, but it has its precedents, and we're going to talk about one of them today. Just as an example, as an exemplar, we're not just looking at objects statically, but recognizing that their objectivity is always in some kind of a resonance. There's always an iteration, whether it's on the subatomic level, or the molecular level, or the intercellular level. Iteration and resonance, and those iterative and resonant moments they build into existential thusnesses. That's the way they used to talk about 2,500 years ago. The Sanskrit term for that was tathata, something that is, we would call today, existential. That existentials, things, stuff, are not just made, but they are established because they are iteratively and resonantly constantly being made. So that a better term than made is emergent. That things are stable in their emergence. And that to recognize this means that the initial reality is not of a form, but of a process. And our education began with the most basic process that we know of, and that is nature. And we examined for 12 weeks how the process of nature is like an ocean of change, but it does have a quality. The quality that we began with was the Chinese term Tao, which we found is best looked at as a zero which does not register and yet participates constantly, hidden and invisible. And every time a iterative, resonant, existential builds to a certain level and is ready then to jump to another level, the zero comes into play. It's like counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and when you get to 10, the zero appears. And when you get to 100, another zero appears. These tens, the powers of 10 is what we would say. This is one example of how a jump in orders has something beyond the cardinal sequence counting. It has an ordinal sequence expansion. And so we're learning in a way in which the cardinality weaves with the ordinality seamlessly so that we can do a third kind of an operation, because we're not limiting ourselves just to integrals of cardinal or cardinal plus ordinal, but we are bringing into play a complement to the entire integral mode, and that is differentiation. That the differential is a different mode in the sense that what happens with the differential is that transforms are brought into play. And because there is ordinality in transformation, there are transforms of transforms. So that there is an exponential quality of not just change and sequence, of cardinality, of different orders of ordinality, or even that there are transforms that come into play. but we can now learn how to not just program, but how to play creatively, imaginatively, memorably with the whole process of a differential and integral understanding and living, so that we have new possibilities for ourselves. We're going to be humane, for sure, deeper, better, but also expansive. And so this is a kind of learning to be able to affect that. The learning takes place by phases because a phase structure has a lot of properties that cardinality and ordinality do not have. And so the phase structure is to take 12 presentations for a phase and then have an interval, have a 13th presentation, which is not a part of that set. The phase is a set of 12 presentations arranged in different ways, 4 sets of 3, 1 set of 12, pairs, 6 pairs through it. There are many ways to arrange something like a 12. At the end of that particular set, we have the establishment then of 3 levels of structure which have occurred. One is the cardinality of something that has happened, a presentation, a situation, some existential. In the classic historical Buddha, those episodes were called sutras. Usually the old pronunciation was in Pali, not in Sanskrit, and Pali is a Sanskrit with a southern accent, so it was sutta. The suttas collected together made groups, and the groups collected together made sets. And what we're looking at today is the Mindfulness Sutra of the historical Buddha. And that Mindfulness Sutra is collected in a group of sutras, in fact 10, because the 10 is indeed a structure which is rather universal, not just because of 10 fingers, but the counting to 10 gives one a procedure. Sometimes it's 10. Occasionally, like in the Chinese, we discovered that they will repeat the middle 2 so that you will have 12 instead of 10. So that, for instance, Chinese counting goes by 10s and also by 12s, but they factor it in by taking half of the 10, 5, and multiplying the 12 by half of that 10 so that you get 60, so that the Chinese sequence is a 60-year cycle. Chinese astrology is a 60-year cycle. And Chinese orientation is on the basis that 60-year cycles are the humane set that one can, within that, and by prorating that, come to understand the universe. For us, we're working with sets of 10 like the historical Buddha in India worked with sets of 10, so that the Mindfulness Sutra is grouped with 9 other sutras, and they form a group called the group of the Synopsis of Fundamentals. That it begins with like an indexing, not an index outline, but an index in the sense that this first 10 form a row or a column. You can go either across or down. And that this row or this column, together with other similar rows, similar columns, will together form a pattern, and that pattern is called in mathematics a matrix. And in a matrix, one can do an analytic among other things, mathematically, by taking any column or any row as an operative vector within that matrix and be able to understand the rest of the matrix, even though one has not actually explored exactly every other element in that matrix. If you know the completeness of a column or the completeness of a row, one then can use vector analysis to be able to understand the entire structure. Plus, if one has a vector analysis of two vectors through any kind of a matrix, then one is able to understand how to transform that matrix in any way, indefinitely, infinitely. That is called in mathematics a tensor. Einstein used tensors to develop relativity. And a lot of the genius of the 20th century in science and mathematics was discovering the infiniteness of both. There are more monographs and books published every year now on mathematics than have ever been published before, and there is no limit within sight at all, because it is a field that develops itself in a very primordial way. It develops itself by taking a 0 and a 1 as being approachable indefinitely, infinitely, and out of this one gets an ability not just to count, but to calculate. And so calculus is being able to approach infinitely, infinitesimally, ones and zeros in a relation, and one gets out of this integral and differential equations. So the whole learning that we're undergoing here affords itself very nicely so that when we get in the second year to science, we will be ready to comprehend on a level and in a depth and in an expansion that is characteristic of really great science. But to get there in a comprehensive way, we're beginning, like our species always began, with the most fundamental process of just being in nature and learning and recapitulating all of the phases and steps that got us up to the 21st century. And so our learning began with 5,000-year-old I Ching and with Henry David Thoreau being a surveyor of snowstorms because someone had to be with nature and introduce the dimension of consciousness to it. To observe it as a participant and not just as someone who was watching it, but who was not regarding it as an it, nor just watching, but watchful participation with it, so that he was not just the surveyor, he was a part of the natural process of that snowstorm. And we saw that in Walden, one of those great moments where Thoreau became one of the all-time great imagers of the way in which zero and infinity occur together constantly in the mysteriousness of nature, and occasionally human beings like ourselves, sentient beings like ourselves, have a moment where we realize that they are not disparate, but that they are movable parentheses that constantly are available for us creatively so that we can expand in reality and continue to be ourselves, but continue to also be really expanded. Thoreau's image was how that first winter at Walden, there was a very, very heavy snow, and the snow covered everything, all the doors and all the windows, and his little cabin was completely buried in snow except for the chimney, so that the only way that he could look out was to go to the fireplace and look up the flue through the chimney, and he saw a blue patch, a blue square sky. in the midst of being buried in a snow world. And he realized that this was one of those trigger moments for which he had prepared his whole life to participate with the square openness of the sky. And we used Thoreau and the I Ching to begin. And we found that that phase, that process, its next phase is not another process, but that there is a syncopation to phases in reality. The syncopation is that a process which has emergent dynamic will allow a portion of that dynamic, of that energy, to come out of the dynamic and assume a form. So that energy now has a pair of possibilities. It can remain dynamic as a process, but it can energize itself and reach stability as a form. And so energy as matter, as an existential thing, comes into existence not by itself, but is a paired tandem to the process. And so our education, our learning, follows this reality. And we syncopate then our phases of our inquiry so that we have a process, and then we allow the form, the next phase, to come and emerge out of that, not just to emerge and be there, but to keep emerging and keep iterating. And so to respect this actuality, we don't just take a presentation and make some kind of a line, some kind of geometric sequence. That would be an instruction. You follow the steps, and you don't repeat the steps, because if you followed the steps, why do you have to repeat it? But with our learning, real learning does not take place by instruction. It takes place by an appreciative involvement with the actuality of both the process and the forms. And we'll see that this carries all the way through. In fact, it carries not only all the way through the universe, but it carries all the way through the transform of the universe into a cosmos. And we will find in the second year that there are differential forms and not just integral forms. That objectivity and existence in existentials is an integral objectivity. And that's what we found in rituals. That rituals are actually doing what you do. And when you've completed the doing, the form is established. It isn't just that this action has been done, but the action done mounts up to a stable form, and that's an event. That's an episode. That's an objectivity. That's an existential. And that those count in the universe as things. If one does a ceremony complete right, that ceremony now is objective. It's objectively real. It really happened, and its happening is not on the level of process, but on the level of form, in that that form now has an existential effect for real. It really happens. In the classical historical Buddha, he would call that, because in India at the time, it was called by its Sanskrit name, karma. That causality is not like billiard balls causing an effect, but that there is a whole ecology, a whole sequence, a whole cycle of resonances that together, that set, discloses the karma, not because something has so much been caused, but it has emerged because you have really done this. And one of the things that gets in the way, one of the stumbling blocks, it's generally called ignorance, is that one doesn't know that you have really done such and so. And so the classic Mindfulness Sutra of the historic Buddha is a sutra of sobering up to be able to observe like a participant, like a Thoreau, watching the patch of blue sky emerge from the only angle of vision that would disclose it. And so in the Mindfulness Sutra, the historic Buddha took great care to bring a presentation in a special, methodical way so that one filtered out more and more of the extraneous, more of the detractions, more of the ignorance, until one was brought to a particular angle of vision through which one was able to observe the central pivot of the objective event, what actually happened. And to be able to do this was classically said to be the key to unlocking the addictive enslavement to karma. And when that is unlocked and one is freed from that, one is in a different realm. One is in a realm of freedom from being deluded by the falsity of one's ignoring the objectiveness of action building to form. This Mindfulness Sutra is recorded twice in the historic Buddha's material, two different sets. And the sets of the sutras, in order to make it not based on some kind of projected metaphysics, were left on the basis of length of presentation. And the longest presentations were brought together in a sequence called the Digha Nikaya. There are 5 Nikayas. The longest ones were put, and they're called the Digha Nikaya. The middle length ones were put together and called the Majjhima Nikaya. And there were so many short ones that they were put into 2 collections plus a whole further sequence of 14 other smaller collections together. So that the first Nikaya are the long sayings, the second is the middle length sayings, then come the gradual sayings, and then the kindred sayings, and then there are 14 books that make up a collection which are usually called the minor sayings. The Mindfulness Sutra is from the second collection. It's from the middle length sayings. And in a way, the middle length sayings of the historical Buddha are like the New Testament. They have that kind of an effect that once one understands the structure of the Majjhima Nikaya, you understand the entire structure of Buddhism complete. It is, excuse me, it is the matrix by which one could understand all of Buddhism. This is I'm fine, thanks. This is one of the structures of the way in which an education, a learning like ours, is able in the 21st century to not only recapitulate the triumphs of human beings from all over the planet, from every civilization, but to bring them into play creatively so that they remain as traditionally excellent as they always have been, but they also now come into a new ratio, a new relationality, because we are building a new civilization. But we're building it not in the sense of post and beam. We're building it organically to be resonant, to be iteratively vibrant, to be vibrant in a sense that we will be in a civilization that constantly refreshes and renews itself, rather than like past civilizations that would take a traditional heritage that would have a timeline where its energy would run out. The classical historical Buddha predicted that even his excellent exactness would have a timeline to it, and that every 500 years it would atrophy a little bit more, and that after some long while, a number of these sets, the Dharma would run out and there would be no more Dharma in the world. It would have to be renewed again. And his saying that was on the basis that he was not the first Buddha, that there were many Buddhas before him. That happened so far in the past that it was hundreds of thousands of years, and that he was only the most recent. This again is in keeping with the iterative, resonant build-up to groups and sets. And so the Majjhima Nikaya has 152 middle-length sutras collected together in 15 sets. And these 15 sets each have a form, a further form, and that is that there are 3 further sets of 50, so that it would be better to say that there are groups, 15 groups within 3 sets. Every 50 sutras would make a beginning, a middle, and an end, so that one would be able to plot a structure of the Majjhima Nikaya, of the middle-length sayings. Here's the first 50, here's the second 50, here's the third 50. But the fact is that there are 2 extra sutras that occur, and they occur in the 3rd set, in the 4th group, right at the end. And they're numbered in the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutras 141 and 142. So that the next 10, the last 10, are not 140 to 150, but they're 153 to 152, 143 to 152. And the reason for this is that Sutra number 141 is a tab which goes outside of the form. It's like a Navajo rug that we talked about, that will have one thread called the spirit trail that goes out of the composition, goes off the edge, so that one has a possibility for the form, the energy put into that form, to have not just air to breathe, but have spiritual air to breathe, meaning that it is transformable. Another example is the Zensumii Circle, which is not completely closed, but has a slight opening from the big dab at the middle and the slight trailing off at the end. That this was indeed a archetypal form for all rituals in all wisdom traditions. We saw that the development in Greek tragedy of the way in which the language forms would make a choral dance movement where the language would come in a clockwise way almost to the finish and then pivot before it touched and go all the way back through, so that one had, as they would say in Greek meter, a strophe and an antistrophe punctuated by a stand. And that this allowed for the pair of the elements in the structure to completely cover, both in an integral and in a differential way, the entire occurrence of the form. So that the form was not just established by a resonance integrally, but it was established by a pair of modes, integral and differential, punctuated by an interval, by a stand, by an opening. And so our education does this as well. And so the Majjhima Nikaya's number 10 sutra, the Satipatthana Sutra, the Mindfulness Sutra, for us occupies this moment of stand. Next week we begin a whole series of resonant presentations on myth. That myth is, again, a process. So our syncopation is that one phase is a process, the next phase will be a form. So that myth, being a process, it will also have a following phase, which will be concerning a form, and the following phase is symbols. And symbols are the objective mind. So that while objective existence, ritual, action amounting to an actuality comes out of nature, we'll find that symbolic thought, that thinking, is quite objective. Ideas are quite objective. They're quite real. Symbols are quite real. The mind is quite real. And it registers because it has emerged out of myth, which is our experience. The experience of feeling, the experience of images, the experience especially of language. And so that imaged, feeling-toned language characterizes myth as a process, and it is the way in which our experience then will allow for the emergence of the objective space of the mind to really register and really occur. The Mindfulness Sutra of the historic Buddha, as our presentation today, establishes the relationship between the objectiveness of participating with action through to its completeness with the paired tuning fork realization of the mind in its objectivity as a whole. And that when the mind realizes its objectivity as a whole, and at the same time will intuit how that wholeness, that unity, that oneness is affine to the emergence out of the zero infinity openness. In classical Buddhism it was called shunyata, emptiness. So that the saying later on in Japanese Zen, it became a famous saying given the designation mu, like a koan. Emptiness is form, form is emptiness. That they are interpenetrable, and that in their interpenetration we find a relationality that now has a different quality of ratio, a different quality of proportion. The quality of the ratio I used to call the ratio of the real. It is that it is not just a proportion of existentials in an integral mode, but now there are proportions of relationalities. Sometimes some elements are completely imaginary. There are many good mathematics of imaginary numbers, or of possibilities, or of probabilities. And that all of these now will have an availability to us once we have this learning, once we have gone through. And it is the ritual of going through the learning, all the different phases, that will disclose this capacity in ourselves. It's not to find something which is there yet, so much as to build the iteration and resonances, so when they are completed, there will be that, not just a realization, but a recognition. In the ancient classic West, this recognition was always the test of the learning. Plato says in his great theory of education, all real learning is a remembering. And it isn't remembering so much something from the past, it's remembering now that you are real here because you were real then and will again be real. That there is a continuity to that. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back to our focus in the interval after the wonderful pair of masks, the masks of food and the masks of feeling. Nutrition and feeling make a nice interface between ritual and myth. And next week, when we begin with myth, we will immediately immerse ourselves into no longer the ritual actions of objective forms of events and doings, but into a new process, one of experience, one of feeling-toned experience rich with images and imagery, out of which will come, that process will nourish a function of the space of the mind called the imagination. And when we get to symbols by the fourth quarter, we will see that the imagination becomes one of the most interesting parts of the mind. It is the key out of all of the integral structures in the universe. It is the key to the way in which consciousness occurs. Consciousness will have a very particular kind of a function, because we will see that consciousness is, again, a third kind of a process. So by taking a look at myth in a parallel way to nature, we will understand that the third process, and we call in our learning, that is the phase of vision. And that vision is not a form, but is again a process, a third kind of a process, a third stream. Kind of a third stream music. But we need to appreciate myth as a second stream, as a parallel. And when we get to myth, we'll see that that mythic process of experience gives us retrospectively a new look at existence. A new look, because whereas from nature as the only process in the universe, existence emerges resonantly, iteratively as existentials. But when experience comes into play, when myth comes into play, there are now two processes, so that existence is now flanked, as it were, by two streams, so that existence begins to occur not so much just as iterative existentials, but they begin to become islands in the midst of a pair of streams that, when they flow together, they make contact with each other, and the rituals now become suspended, as it were, as islands of existentiality in an ocean that extends nature into experience. And when nature and myth extend themselves as a single process, the quality of existence changes. The islands link together as archipelagos, and as time goes on, the confidence is to link those archipelagos together to make like a ridge of existence. And that becomes then a whole continent, and finally becomes planets and stars within a flow of nature experience that we might call, Thoreau did call it, natural experience. He also used a term that when you add vision to it, when you add a personal consciousness to it, it becomes natural history. And we'll see that history will become a fourth process, a fourth flow. And that just as rituals are flanked by the process of nature and of myth, we'll find that the differential processes of vision and history flank art, flank the artistic person. And once one adds the flow of history to differential qualities, you then have a new kind of a person that has not existed before. You have the creative person who is able to create art forms which are differentially objective. That is to say, they can come and transform all rituals and all symbols. That the entire integral order is now going to be available to be transformed by the artist, by what traditionally was called the spirit person. In historical Buddhism, the phrase was very often the supernal person, meaning the highest person. That one is no longer just the body, nor the body and the mind, nor even just the body, the feelings, and the mind, but now something else has come into play. And what mediates that extra dimension coming into play, the extra dimension of consciousness, is the ability on the integral cycle to be able to come to what the historic Buddha called mental objects, to objectify the mind. So that not just is the mind objective, but in the Mindfulness Sutra, the mental objects are approached by mental objectification. Because the process has begun in the Mindfulness Sutra, the Satipatthana Sutra. These are the words translated out of Pali into English by Miss I.B. Horner about 2 generations ago. The person doing this mindfulness application trains themselves thinking, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. He trains himself thinking, I shall breathe in, tranquilizing the activity of the body. I shall breathe out, tranquilizing the activity of the body. And then he fares along. In this way, fares along contemplating the body in the body. That is, not contemplating the body in the mind, not contemplating the body in experience, but contemplating the body as body itself. So that an objectivity becomes, we would say in geometry, congruent. Instead of there being an experience of the body, or a mind thinking of the body, or thinking through experience to the body occurs objectively as itself, and one, like Thoreau in The Snowstorm, inhabits the body purely objectively. But the Mindfulness Sutra then goes on saying, he fares along contemplating the body in the body, internally, externally, internally and externally, or fares along contemplating origin things in the body, dissolution things in the body, thinking there is this body established precisely to the extent necessary, just for knowledge, just for remembrance, faring along independently, not grasping anything in the world. It is thus that one contemplates the body in the body. So one will establish this kind of a ritual level of the body. Then the same process is applied and stepped up to experiencing the feelings by feeling in feelings. And a third level will be established of experiencing the mind in the mind. And then a fourth level will be introduced, experiencing mental objects as mental objects by a mental object. so that the objectivity goes from the ritual body to the objective mind, making a set of four mindfulnesses. Now notice what we have been saying consistently through ritual. Ritual always has a numeracy quality to it. It's always numerical, it's always numbers, it's always counting, it's always arithmetical. And that numeracy, now, when we get to myth, will change itself from the objective form of numeracy to the experience process of literacy. Not literacy in the sense of writing yet, that will come with symbols, but in the fact of oral language. Now, not being discursive so much, but being storytelling. And to tell the stories in such a way that one feelingly inhabits the stories. One has a role to play. One has a part to play. And so myth will be that quality of experience where we play in the stories and are of the stories. And we're going to take as our first pair of books two women. One, Inanna, the myths of the Queen of Heaven from ancient Sumeria, from ancient Akkad. The author of it was the world's first great writer. Her name was Inanna, and her father was Sargon of Akkad, who established the great civilization of the Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. And that Fertile Crescent was the first international empire in the world. And it was his daughter, Inanna, who was raised in this royal household of being exposed to many different cultures, not just many different Sumerian cities that would make a confederation of Sumerian cities in Sumeria, or in northern Sumeria, Akkad, or in further north. There were all kinds of confederations of cities for quite some time, more than 1,000 years. But Inanna grew up in the first international civilization where there were trade routes linking about more than 20 or 30 different areas together, and went from not just the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, but along the Mediterranean coast of the Near East down to Egypt. And not just to the Persian Gulf, but along the Persian Gulf all the way to India. So that Inanna grew up in an international world that linked the Indus Valley civilizations and the Nile Valley civilization with the Akkadian Sumerian civilizations of the Euphrates and Tigris. And so you had three great river civilizations that for the first time were interlinked together in business, in trade, in intercultural relations. And so Inanna's mythology by Inanna is the world's first presentation of a new kind of a woman who is able in her divinity not only to be a queen of the upper things, of the upper world, the overworld, the civilized control and comprehension of most of the recognized planet of the time, but she was also able to go down within to the center of the underworld, of the netherworld, because one has a pair of capacities. One goes deeper as one goes higher at the same time. This is a phenomenon in my development of the great book I've been working on civilizations of the planet. The key is that the past and the future are always related together. They always have a symmetry together. Their pairedness is a pair of symmetricality. And that the symmetry in nature and in myth will be weighted towards a forward movement of time. Just like change in nature creates a dimension of time that has a forward arrow quality to it. Experience will have the same kind of dynamic, that it will yield further experience. And the past does not tend to record. Whereas in differential consciousness, for the first time we'll see in vision, in consciousness, that it can go into the past in such a way that the past is not just some static box of what happened then, and then one goes back into that box. That's a limitation of the integral mind. But we'll see that with consciousness, consciousness going back in time to the past comes back with a capacity to add the dimension of transform to it on every deepening levels, so that one can transform not only an idea of the past, but one can transform the experience of the past. One can relive the past in a new way. And even deeper, one can go back to the ritual actions of existence and transform them as well. So that even on the level of resonances and iterations, consciousness can go back as a transformer. It's a famous issue in quantum mechanics since the 1930s. The observer changes the experiment. Time, space, in its integral are no longer limited to just time forward, spatiality, but now there's a reversibility, but the reversibility is differential, not integral. One doesn't go back in the past like Wells's time machine. One goes back into the past differentially, and so there are many pasts available for the first time. The meaning of this is that the conscious person has many possibilities of being and can create themselves realistically, even on the level of changing their objective actions, so they now read out differently in a changed experience, and what comes out is a new mind. Not the old mind at all, not even the old mind in its kind, but a new kind of mind, completely new. And so the phrase always is that it used to be that it's a new man, but it's deeper than a new man. It's a new being. This was the goal of the historic Buddha in India. In that civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, it reached its apex about 2600 BC. The historic Buddha came about 2,100 years later. So he emerged from a classic civilization that was as old to him as, say, Ptolemaic Alexandria would be to us today. He would have emerged from a civilization that would have had a historical remembrance going back as we would have back to the time of before Julius Caesar, before Cicero, back to the early days of the Hellenistic empires. And so the historical Buddha was extraordinarily sophisticated in his time, and yet in his time it was such a new disclosure that it took quite some time for its resonances to build to enough sets of actuality so that the experience became full enough to nourish the ideas that finally emerged. And it took about almost 200 years, 250 years for this to happen. And the person in India who redid the entire Indian civilization, who took the classic Indus civilization in its Rig Veda transformed from about 1500 BC, in its Buddhist transformed from about 500 BC, and introduced a completely new quality to a transform about 250 BC. He transformed Indian civilization into a Greco-Buddhist civilization. And the reason for this is that his grandfather, whose name was Chandragupta, and he was the head of the Maurya clan, and he is the first person in military history to find a way to defeat Alexander the Great and stop his advance. And his advance was stopped in India by a classic example of military strategy. They let Alexander win so many battles so quickly that his supply lines strung out so far, so fast, that when they got to the Ganges, his men sized up the fact that they were not going to be able to cross the Ganges. At that point, the Ganges is about 4 or 5 miles wide. And on the other side was a general, one of Chandragupta Maurya's generals, Porus, with war elephants lined up on the shore, and Alexander's army refused to follow him any further. And so he stopped there. And so he was defeated not by force of arms, but by strategic expansion to the point to where his dynamic ran out. And so the classic figure who took his grandfather's strategy and decided to expand the possibilities of his civilization so far that the normal aggressive dynamics of people or of groups would run out. There would be so many possibilities, and there would be so many events that one could do that you were in like a creative ocean, and you couldn't spare the time to start trying to be aggressive to take something from someone else, because you could make on your own so many new things. And that emperor was called, his name was Ashoka. And Ashoka was a mulatto. His mother was a Greek princess. The word in Sanskrit for Greeks at that time was Yavana. His mother was a Greek princess, and his father, of course, was one of the most powerful sons of Chandragupta Yoga, the founder of the Mauryan dynasty in India. And Ashoka was about number 50 of the sons of his father, but all those sons killed each other off until only Ashoka was left alive. And this splotchy-skinned mulatto took over the empire and then changed it completely. By that time, Ashoka's empire spanned almost all of what is today India and Pakistan into Afghanistan. He disbanded all of his armies. He put columns called lion pillars, because at the tops there were lions, sculptural lions facing the 4 directions, and he put the simple edicts by which everyone lives in India, in Ashokan India, at the gates of all the passes and at the harbors coming into India, and made roads linking the entire empire, planted medicinal herbs and nut and fruit trees and shade trees, and then let the empire be free. And for about 50 years, Ashokan India survived without any kind of military or police whatsoever. One of the great exemplars in human history. Ashoka's youngest son was named Mahinda, and he became, because Ashoka made it a Greco-Buddhist empire, his youngest son became the first missionary to go to Sri Lanka, to go to Ceylon at the time. And because he was very venerated because of his father and because of his own qualities, he is called in history Mahinda Thera. Thera means an old respected person, very honorable, like a sir, Mahinda Thera. And when Mahinda Thera went to Ceylon, he went to the capital of Ceylon, Anuradhapura, up in the mountains, and there delivered one of the Majjhima Nikaya sutras personally, and it was a sutra called the Elephant's Footprint. And in the Majjhima Nikaya, very often there are pairs of sutras, one of them called the Kula, so-and-so, the other called the Maha, so-and-so. The Kula means the lesser, the Maha means the greater. And it doesn't mean an importance, it means that the emphasis in the Kula is more honed, and in the Maha is opened up. So that in the one, you get the angle of vision going to the central pivot of what it's all about, whereas in the Maha, you get the square showing the space of the entirety. We talked last week, and you can listen to Ritual 12 and the tape of the difference between taking a square of attention, as we call it, a frame, the picture. If you take the sides, you see the space. If you take the angles, you see the center, the central pivot, the purpose. And that you don't need all four angles, all you need is one. And so if you have one angle, and the classic 90-degree angle that makes the right triangle of Pythagoras, if you have one angle, you know the entirety of the triangle, and you know the entirety then of the square, and you know the diagonal of the square, and the distance between the angle to the center will be your radius, therefore you know also the circularity of it. And one is able to disclose the entire geometry in that way. But it will be a geometry of the plane, because the plane that is related to it is the space of the sides of the square. And so when one used to build, the carpenter's square was one of a pair of tools that was absolutely essential. You had to learn to square your angle, and then you could make a structure that would be stable if you added one more element to it. And so the carpenter's square, it was usually an L shape with a little connector about midway through to keep the angle perfectly 90 degrees. The other pair to it was the plumb bob. And the plumb bob was the feminine, and the carpenter's square was the masculine. And in the earliest Chinese, 3000 BC, one found two mythological figures, Fu Shi, who held the carpenter's square, the angle of vision, and his consort Nu Gua, who held the plumb bob, which was the pivot of the centering. And once one can center a squared triangulation, centered spatial form, one has an objectivity now that is, we call still today, architectural. And that if one can do this, one has then an architecture not just of buildings, but of a life. Now we have a life that has an architectural integrity. And further, the interrelationship of peoples makes an architecture of the community. And those communities can be arranged in groups that accrue to sets, so that one now has an architecture of a whole civilization. And one final step from that is that there is such a thing now as an architecture of reality that is discernible for the first time and consistent all the way through. So that the architecture of reality in classical Greco-Roman civilization, the great writer on the architecture of reality is Plotinus. And one will find that Plotinus's talks, his sutras, are collected together into groups, and those groups collected together into sets. There are 9 Plotinus sermons. The Greek word sermione means interpretations. in Latin, sermon. In Greek, the classical term was hermeneia. If one has the hermeneia, the sermons, the talks, collected into groups, and those groups collected into sets, and that put into a matrix, one now has the ability to determine the architecture of reality. 9 talks by Plotinus made up a book, and there were 6 books, so altogether there were 54. So the matrix of Plotinian philosophy is 54. The matrix of the Majjhima Nikaya is 152. Not so much that it's larger, but it's a very similar kind of presentation. With the Majjhima Nikaya for the first time, Mahindathera, when he went to Ceylon, when he went to the capital in the hills, Anuradhapura, he introduced something that had never been there before, and that was the ability to discern, to train oneself to see the architecture of persons and of societies and of the civilization and of the cosmos, all in ascending orders of differential waves that followed each other in such a way so that one now had a different kind of a logic. John Dewey used to call it the logic of inquiry. It is a logic that continually improves itself and refines itself the more that you use it. It works like a jet engine. The faster you go, as long as you have fuel, the more air, the better it works. Is this sort of thing. So that the dynamic of individual lives no longer was something that just you had energy when you were young, and then as you grew older, you lost energy, and finally you died with a whimper. Or that societies, cultures, eventually lost energy and died. Or that civilizations lost energy. But that the dynamic is now distributed evenly through the entire field. Because the pivot works continuously everywhere at the same time. This is a completely different sort of a structure. And so when Mahindathera brought this into Ceylon, it worked a transform of Ceylon, of ancient Lanka, into a completely new place. And he left there the Majjhima Nikaya as the matrix, the basic matrix by which they could begin to educate themselves in a logic of inquiry for not just a lifelong learning, but for a learning that would continually refine itself as it went on. So throughout all the vicissitudes of many centuries, finally it was a figure who went back to Ceylon about 1,000 years after the Buddha. His understanding was so beautiful that they called him Buddhaghosa, the voice of the Buddha. And around 400 AD, about 1,000 years after the Buddha, he went back to Ceylon. And there in Anuradhapura, he gave a complete series of commentaries on all of the Nikayas, and the one on the Majjhima Nikaya is translated here by a monk named Somathera, and it's called The Way of Mindfulness, a translation of the Satipatthana Sutra of the Majjhima Nikaya, and its commentary, the Satipatthana Sutta Vana of, and that is the particular item in a logical set, and the set of the whole commentary is called the Papancha Sudani. Papancha means generating clouds of it, and it means that this is a kind of a commentary that does not exhaust the meaning, but generates more and more meaning, so that when you get used to it, it's like having a software that is creative that now you can do more and more. And so the Majjhima Nikaya became not only the matrix in classical Buddhist India, it became the matrix transformed in Greco-Buddhist India, introduced into places like Sri Lanka, and from there to Burma, to Thailand, to to various places. And a couple of hundred years later, the success was such that Buddhism now was an international civilization that carried with it the possibilities of business on almost a worldwide scale. So that one of the most enterprising emperors in Central Asia, named Kanishka, came down into India specially to make a very forceful invitation to the number one Buddhist monk of his time named Ashvaghosha. Ashvaghosha is the sound of a horse neighing. He was such a vigorous, creative, imaginative person that Kanishka took Ashvaghosha back with him, back into Central Asia. And this is how Buddhism spread finally around 90 AD into China, Japan, Korea, Afghanistan, all the northern Central Asia. So that you had, through something like a matrix of the Majjhima Nikaya, an ability for it to become almost a worldwide civilization. In Alexandria, classic Greco-Roman Alexandria, they were not called Buddhists, they were called gymnosophists. They were athletic wisdom people. They were athletes of the spirit, because it was the Greek way of understanding that their practice of this method was like an athlete that trains himself to be mindful of the body in the body, to be feeling of feelings in the feeling, to be present in the mind, and to be able to see mental objects by a mental object, and to keep all of it distinct so that the integral, instead of being smushed together and mulched together in a kind of defective, chaotic way, half-baked at best, now the integral resonances were set up so that each one distinct had an ability to relate distinctly to each other, and what emerged was the reality of effective proportion. And when proportion is effective, one now has a new scale called a harmonic. And consciousness as a process of vision occurs because a harmonic can have all of its elements struck together. It's called the chord. And when we speak of such a chord, we speak of it, of course, as a concord. And so a human being had a chance to be able to strike the concord of their reality vis-a-vis the society, the civilization, the universe, the community, others, and that the resonance of this would carry into all actions, all experience, all qualities of mind, space, all qualities of ideas and symbols, and into a shared consciousness. So this was really an extraordinary revolution. Now we're going to pair with Inanna next week, with N.A. Joanna's great original epic written about 2300 BC. We're going to pair Jane Ellen Harrison's Prolegomena to the study of Greek religion, because we want to bring in, again, remind ourselves, we're constantly working now with what we have established. The ancient Sumerian genius of civilization, when it was brought into play with the original Greeks about 1,500 years before Alexander the Great, brought a new scale of civilization. We're not used to thinking of Greece going back beyond the classical realm, but it went back not only to an ancient Greece, 1,000 years before Plato, it went back to an archaic Greece that was almost 1,500 years before Plato. And Jane Ellen Harrison is one of the first people to really effectively explore this new expanded mythic dimension of Greek religion. More next week.